Hello everybody, I'm Selective. This will be part 2, chapter 2 of Susurrus of the Subdued, SOS. From here on out, this fic will play heavily into the trigger warnings, so I suggest you take a look at them. They're in the description below. Whether you choose to leave or stay, that is completely up to you, but know that your health matters and comes first. Now, with nothing else to say, let's get started. The man looked down at the research his workers acquired over the past few days. Papers lie scattered across every surface in sight, creating a mess that made the guy's skin blister, itch, and burn. Adjusting his pointy mask to ensure it was on correctly, the imposing figure moved to pick up a manila folder in a neatly gloved hand. "Is this all the information you managed to get in the 3 months I've given you?" he asked, turning the thin folder in his hand with a scrutinizing gaze. One of the men nodded, willing the nervousness out of his voice. "Yes, sir." The man hooked his thumb under the top lid of the folder, bringing his other hand up in order to catch the bottom of it once he flipped it open. His gaze moved across the contents, the skin on his forearm blistering slightly as the anger he felt became visible through his eyes. "This is the information we already had," the man said, voice cutting through the air like a knife, carefully flat. "Yes, sir," the lackey repeated, hands moving in front of him to clasp together. "Japan's quirk registry is extremely hard to get into, and..." The imposing man took a step closer as his left index finger hooked under the elastic of his right white glove. The worker took a step back in return, voice raising an octave. "Not to mention, quirkless people are very rare. Their population is only down to around 10%. You have to understand..." The employee was cut off as their boss's ungloved hand made contact with their skin. A sickening crunch sounded out as the wall behind the once whole man became painted in blood. The worker's lower half slumped to the floor, a mix of soggy clothing and liquid mixing together on the ground. The individual, masked in gold and brown, looked down at the mess as he regloved his hand. "Clean this up. You have 2 more months to find me something useful, not this crap." The folder was tossed onto the table in front of the other worker before he walked out of the room. Izuku groaned awake, the pain radiating from his nose enough to warrant a groan. Shifting, the green-haired boy reached a tentative hand to feather his fingers across the bridge. When pain bloomed from the touch, he retracted it and allowed the appendage to fall to his side. Viridian eyes blinked open, staring tiredly up at the ceiling. His body felt exhausted, his muscles not wanting to move, and his joints seemingly locked in place. The boy knew he had school, but the throbbing pain that sat behind his eyes was making him not want to move. Sitting up, Midoriya grumbled, running a hand through his grimy mop. His hand came to stop on the top of his head, fingers threaded through the sleep-tangled curls. Izuku sighed, looking down. His nose felt swollen, the nostrils unable to take in air, and any air he did manage to get in shot pain through his head. Getting up with a hand over his nose gingerly, Izuku made his way to the restroom. The boy's feet patted against the floor, each step seemingly making his headache bloom into new areas. When he finally made it to the bathroom, he pushed the agape door out of the way and cracked his eyes open, trying his best to look at his nose in the dark. When it didn't do him any good by squinting in the unlit room, the green-haired boy squeezed his eyes shut once more, reaching his hand out to the switch. He fumbled in the dark for a moment before his fingers brushed against it. He flicked the switch on before opening his eyes, only to immediately shut them again with a wince. The sting of his headache increased in a spike due to the sheer brightness of the room, and even with his eyelids shutting out most of the light, it was still causing the pain in his head to increase. Izuku took a moment to adjust to the ache before slowly peeking hooded lids open. Looking at himself in the mirror, the boy paused. Under his eyes were a dark shade of blue that blended with his natural complexion at the edges. A similar shade was on the tip and bridge of his nose, the bruise darkening towards the center. Midoriya cringed, nose wrinkling carefully. His shaking hand came up to feather over the injury once more, the corners of his eyes lining with tears. Was it broken? The child's heart sped up slightly, eyebrows pinching together at the edges. Panic crept its way into his mind at all the implications that this injury could entail. His mother couldn't know about it. She couldn't afford a spontaneous trip to the doctors. Besides, knowing he broke a bone at school would just make her worry. Bending down slowly, in order to not aggravate the ache in his head, Izuku reached to grab the first aid kit he kept under the sink of his bathroom. He always made sure to keep it stocked, knowing that he could need it at any point in time. His classmates didn't really care for limitations when it came to their harassment toward him, going as far as using their quirks on him. It started recently, the practice seemingly getting worse by the day. Therefore, keeping a kit full of supplies was always a must. Setting the container on the counter, the green-haired boy zipped it open to pull out a nose plaster. It was white in color, a metal piece located in the center to hold the broken bone or cartilage in place. Peeling the back off of it, he returned his gaze to the mirror, hovering the bandage over his face to adjust where it needed to be. Once he found the position suitable, Izuku gingerly put the splint in place, wincing slightly. His fingers gently applied pressure to the edges, making sure it wouldn't come off. He let his hands drop to the edge of the counter, looking in the mirror for a long moment. He didn't like what he saw. The plaster on his nose was as foreign as ever, along with the bruise peeking out from under it, plus his hooded eyes. But the untamed mop of curls was familiar. He couldn't stand how they always seemed to go in every direction, no matter how hard he worked to control them. He also disliked the fact that his freckles made his complexion seem much lighter than it already was. Sure, he didn't go out into the sun as much, but that was because of safety reasons. The people around his apartment complex knew who he was, and therefore knew his quirk status. If he could get beat up at school, what's to say he couldn't near his own home? Sighing, Izuku shifted most of his weight into his left arm, using his free hand to turn on the tap. He turned the back of his wrist into the stream of water, waiting for it to be at least lukewarm. Once he was satisfied, he returned his hand to the counter, bent down, and submerged his head under the flow of water. The water ran through his curls, spiraling down the wavy strands until it came into contact with his scalp. It was cooler than he would have liked it to be, but it placated the pain in his head nonetheless. The green-haired kid stayed still for a moment, eyes shut and lips slightly parted in order to keep the water out of his respiratory system when he eventually decided to breathe in. He shifted his weight to lean the front of his hips against the counter's edge, all the while moving his fingers to card through his mop. Midoriya didn't feel like taking a shower today, the pain in his head and the ache in his side enough to scare off the idea. So the sink was the next best thing. That way, at least his hair wasn't grimy at school, and he looked somewhat decent. After all, the boy didn't want to give his bullies more ammo. Turning off the tap, Izuku stood up straight, allowing the water to pool at the tips of his curls and weigh them down, before eventually falling onto his shoulders and back. His clothes darkened with each drip, the liquid seeping into the fibers and dampening the upper half of his torso. He reached over and grabbed the same old towel he used to dry his hands the previous day, now using it to scrunch his curls. The boy sighed while putting the rag up, walking out of the restroom in the process. His head still hurt like hell, the pain radiating from his nose still spreading throughout his skull. It wasn't enough to make him bedridden, but that didn't mean he didn't not want to be. If the boy was being completely honest, he would rather spend his days in bed than Aldera. The mix of pillows and blankets was safe, and it provided him with a warm comfort that the world beyond his room couldn't. When his laptop caught in the corner of his eye, he paused, turning to look at it. The page from the night before was still pulled up, the imposing sight locked away behind the shut screen. His heart clenched as he recalled the information gained last night, and, with the returning sensation of his headache mixing in with the pain in his heart, the boy looked away. He didn't feel like filling a page right now. Going to his closet, Izuku pulled out the wrinkled black uniform, moving to set it on his bed shortly after. Walking into Aldera, Midoriya briskly made his way over to his Garabako. Once in front of it, he placed a hand on the cold metal, shifting his weight into it. His free hand reached down, index finger hooking into the back of his red shoes before pulling them off. He repeated the action one more time prior to slipping on the plain white shoes that once sat in his small locker. The green-haired child then tapped his shoes against the ground a few times to ensure that they were on correctly before making his way to class. He only prayed that when he got back to his locker that his property lay untouched. Shuffling into the classroom, Izuku's gaze caught onto his childhood friends, the latter giving him a light glare before turning away. Meanwhile, the former mentally sighed in relief, glad that Katsuki wasn't going to bother him that morning. His head was still pounding, the painkillers he took before leaving the house not doing much yet. So, the green-haired boy really didn't want another thing added to his plate to make his day worse. Sitting down, Midoriya placed his arms onto the surface of his desk. He rested his forehead down onto them, shifting around ever so slightly until he found comfort. Izuku then allowed his eyes to shut, breathing out a deep sigh. He'd get up when the first bell rang, not wanting to get embarrassed for being called out on his impromptu nap. But for now, the child just wanted to rest. Izuku placed down his bag as his bedroom door shut behind him. The pain in his head had dulled to a low throb, the Tylenol he took earlier finally kicking in enough to actually dwindle the ache. Not to mention, his school day had been mostly uneventful, only a few whispers here and there. Moving to his desk instinctively, he sat down, hands already moving to open both his laptop and pull his notebook off the shelf. His fingers moved with practice ease, typing in the password and letting the computer load in at a snail's pace. When his gaze caught onto the job listing webpage, the boy could only pause. Memories from his last session flooded his mind, and that discouraging feeling made its way back into his gut. His finger applied excessive pressure onto the mouse pad, limb shaking. Furthermore, his hand felt clammy as he stared at the screen, the mild pain in his skull fading into the background. Izuku's mind became plagued with thoughts far too deprecating for him to fully process them all. He shut his eyes tightly, taking a deep breath to calm his raging mind. A moment later, they reopened and his expression soured slightly, a frown tugging at his lips. The child then quickly closed the tab. He didn't want to look at that sight again, knowing it would only make his mood worse. As the other tab finally came onto screen, to replace the now non-existent one, finally loaded, Midoriya came face to face with the same comment by the anonymous user. He stared at it for a long moment, mind racing. Izuku didn't let his gaze leave the words on screen. Did he really have to apply to an official job in order to help people? If he wanted to make a living off of his notes, or at least try to, he'd actually have to submit a portfolio. That is to say, if his analyses were even good enough to use for a profit. However, the green-haired child knew that if he did apply, he'd only be rejected. Although if he did sell them, he could put the money towards helping his mother. If that were the case, he'd have to lie to her, tell her he had gotten a job in order to keep her from rejecting the money that he seemingly pulled out of thin air. It was either that or just sneaking the money into her things slowly. Furthermore, if he sold his notes, it would enable him to help people like he wanted. Making up his mind, Izuku clicked the reply button. Reply to Anonymous 235 from Anonymous 5342, April 29th. How much are you willing to pay? The next morning, the green-haired boy woke up to an inbox that was one notification heavier. Bonus scene. Bakugo shifted on the desk he was sitting on, looking away from the classmate he was talking to as a familiar head of green curls caught in the corner of his eyes. Deku was walking into class with his head ducked, his usual timid demeanor causing the boy to have a slight hunch to his shoulders. The blonde planned to just ignore the nerd, but the fucker must have felt him staring, as Izuku's head lifted a bit. Deku's gaze drifted, looking at Katsuki through the corners of his eyes. That's when he noticed it. Izuku's face was normal for the most part, freckles, creepy green eyes, and a wobbly line for a mouth all still there. But the bright white plaster on his nose was new. Crimson eyes flicked towards it for only a moment before they were back on Viridian ones. It wasn't like Katsuki was worried or anything. He wasn't friends with the nerd, and in turn, didn't need to be concerned over something so minor. That didn't mean he couldn't think about it, though. After all, the bruise that was spread across the bridge of Izuku's nose and cheekbones was dark. Not to mention, the stupid bandage on his face was doing nothing to cover it. Katsuki's expression hardened, jaw tightening, before he looked away from the other boy. The blonde didn't want to look at the nerd, look at that injury anymore. The sight of it was making his mind go to places he didn't want it to. He didn't want it to be on Deku at all. He was already enough of a parasite in Katsuki's life. Bakugo shifted on the surface of his desk, readjusting his position so that he could focus back in on the conversation going on in front of him. Whatever the fuck was going on with Deku, it wasn't his business. He didn't need to care. And he sure as hell wasn't going to get involved. He'd let the nerd do whatever stupid idea that flowed through his head if it meant that other people finally stepped up and did his job for him. That they saw how annoying the nerd could be. Besides, he'd be fine. Deku could take it. Alright everybody, that concludes Part 2, Chapter 2 of Susurrus of the Subdued. Please make sure to check out the Discord if you haven't already. If you would like to get updates easier, get connected with people within the fanfiction community, make requests for a podfic, and more. The link to the server will be in the description. I will also, once again, be linking Bomb or Shitart Zero's socials in the description below, so please check that out as well. Now, I hope you enjoyed and thank you for listening.